So YouTube is almost ready. Just wait for it to tell me that it's got it done correct. Hi, Roberta. And there we go. Put that over there. Oh, you're logging in through your phone?
I log in the phone also.
Yep.
Okay.
You know, whatever the technology is that works.
Yes.
Bueno, porque quien atienda que yo no sé si está subiendo la.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, good to hear you. All right, I think we're at our 6:02 mark. That's a good time to go ahead and get things rolling. And besides, I need to do a little introduction to today's topic. So it may seem a little surprising for those of you more familiar with the Hebrew calendar that we are going to start talking about the different days of mourning in the Jewish annual cycle. The most famous, of course, being Tisha B'Av, and the one that will take up a lot of our time. But I'm going to go on vacation. And that means that I'm going to be unable to have weekly sessions for our pathway class until July 1. And by the time we get there, you're already going to need to know this information. So it's a little early, but it's as late as I can give it to you and still have you have the information ready to go when the calendar rolls around. So if you haven't been thinking about this part of our calendar lately, that's okay, that's normal. I had to just look down the road to make sure I got you the information before you actually needed it. With that in mind, we are going to be looking today at the main days on the Jewish calendar that are days of fasting. Most of these are considered days of mourning, and we're going to talk a lot more about them and their observance. But I do want to point out the one elephant not in the room, and that is the holiday of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the day when it is most famously, it's the day most famously associated with fasting. And we are not going to talk about that and its fast today, because Yom Kippur is part of a different cycle of days. And Yom Kippur's fast is not a fast for mourning. It is not a fast to create sadness. It is a fast of reflection, but not for gloomy reflection and sadness. It is meant to inspire us. So that's why Yom Kippur is not going to be on our discussion today. But of course, Yom Kippur does have a fast. And when we talk about the high holidays as a unit, I'll go into much more detail for that. Instead, we're going to talk about the days that unfortunately don't always get enough screen time. And I'll explain as we go through why it has become that these days don't get talked about enough. So, clicked on the wrong part of the screen. So let's go ahead and start with the days in order of how they occurred historically, because all of the main days that we're going to talk about are days associated with the destruction, first and foremost, of the first temple of Jerusalem. This is the temple of Solomon. This is the temple that was destroyed in 586 BCE. And it was not destroyed overnight. And as we'll see from the prophetic literature, there are days set aside to commemorate different parts of the events. So let's begin chronologically with the events as they occurred, even though as the Jewish calendar goes, you'll see it's not exactly in order. But that should, it'll be clear. So the 10th of Tevet, also known as Asara B'Tevet, which, a little bit of an aside, once you get your Hebrew up to speed, you'll realize that the names of many Jewish holidays are quite boring. So Asara B'Tevet, when you translate that into English, means the 10th of Tevet, Tevet being the name of the Hebrew month. So the 10th of Tevet, Asara B'Tevet, this is a day usually in December or January, and I'll have the dates for the next calendar cycle a little bit later on. This is a date which commemorates the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586, roughly, meaning that the date is a little plus and minus depending upon where you count the beginning of the year. So 586 BCE, the Babylonians attack the city of Jerusalem. They lay siege engines around, they surround the city, and they begin attacking. But it takes a while before their attacks are able to break through the walls of Jerusalem. And that then leads us to the 17th of Tammuz. Now, in Hebrew, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, which again means the 17th of Tammuz. And this usually occurs in June or July. Again, remembering that the Gregorian January, February, March, April calendar is not perfectly aligned with the lunar calendar of Judaism. That's why there are a couple months it could be in. So this date is in commemoration of the breach of Jerusalem walls by the Babylonians, meaning that on this day, the walls around Jerusalem, they were broken in places, so the troops of the Babylonians could rush into the city. And that meant that the siege of Jerusalem moved to the next stage. According to our tradition, this day also commemorates a number of other events. The first tablets brought down from Mount Sinai that were broken on this day, meaning that moment when Moses saw the golden calf and smashed the tablets, that was also the 17th of Tammuz. This is also considered by tradition to be the day when the Seleucids burnt the first Torah scroll. The Seleucids are, you may remember from our discussion of Hanukkah, were the empire that tried to eradicate Judaism as a religion. And they were very opposed, of course, to the teaching of Torah. The 17th of Tammuz is also then the day when an idol was erected in the temple. So this is a day of many disasters, not the most disasters, we'll come to that one later, but this has other disasters than just the breach of the walls. And as I said, I'll explain exactly when the next occurrences of these days are, but do we have any questions about the historical timeline up to this point? All right. Then we come in the timeline to the biggie. This is the 9th day of Av, also known as Tisha B'Av. It is usually in July or August. And unlike the previous two, which I forgot to mention, unlike the previous two, which are what are known as daylight fasts, this is a 24-hour fast. Now, what does that mean practically? Well, for a daylight fast, our fasting, and we'll go into all the details of what that means, of what we are abstaining from, our fasting lasts from the beginning of light until the beginning of the stars and darkness, nightfall. And that is the period that we spend in our fast. On the other hand, a full 24-hour fast, usually a little bit more than 24 to be technical, begins from the fall of night on the day before, all the way until the fall of night on the next day. On an English calendar, this will cover 2 days, beginning in the evening and going to the next evening, covering the same time period that we would observe Shabbat, for example, or any of our other holidays. That means that for 24 hours, we will be observing all of the stringencies of our fast, which again, I will explain in more detail. Now, what is it that we are commemorating on the Tisha B'Av that makes it a more serious level of fasting and sadness? Well, this is the date when the first and second temples of Jerusalem were destroyed. The first, as I mentioned, is continuing from our timeline begun with the siege. The second temple was the one destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE, which is about 500 years later. So both of the temples were destroyed on the same day. And yes, that does mean that there is a compounding effect of our grief and sadness. Also on this day, because it's not just this is the day that it was decreed that the generation who left Egypt would not enter Israel. If you are studying in the Torah, in the Parashat B'Shalach, where the spies go up into Egypt and then they come back with the bad report, this is the day when God said, fine. You guys aren't ready to go to Israel. The next generation it'll be. You're going to spend the rest of the years until you're gone, which turns out to be a total of 40 years here in the wilderness of Sinai, and then the next generation will go. That decision happened on this day. This was also the day for the fall and massacre of Beitar. Beitar, you should look up in more detail when we do more history. We'll talk about it again. This was the last stronghold of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt was the almost successful revolt of the Jewish leaders led by Bar Kokhba. That was the name of the chief general against the Roman Empire in around the year 136 CE. This was meant to liberate us from them after the destruction of the Second Temple. It worked for a while, and then it came crashing down and we were wiped out. And the last place that was held by them was the fortress of Beitar, and it fell on this day. This is also the day when the Romans plowed the Temple Mount into desolation, meaning that they took the top of the Temple Mount, where if you've seen a picture of Jerusalem today, you'll see that there is a very large building with a gold dome. That is the site, more or less, of where the Second Temple stood. And the Romans, not happy to have merely defeated us in war, also decreed that that area should be completely obliterated, razed to the ground so that not a trace of the Second Temple would stand there. That decree happened and was executed on this day. And this is the date in 1095 CE, 1,000 years ago, when the Pope declared the First Crusade. Now, the First Crusade was aimed officially against the Muslims in the land of Israel, or the Holy Land, as the Pope wanted to call it. But the Crusaders practiced their slaughter first on Jews in Europe, killing tens of thousands of people who lived there, and then killed many of the Jews in Israel as well when they arrived and defeated the Muslims. So the Crusades were not a happy time for us. They were not a joyful time. Even though the Muslim conquest also wasn't great, the Crusades really were even worse. So the fact that this is the day when they were decreed by the Pope adds to our remembrance of pain. This is also from 1290, the day when the Jews were expelled from England. This is, in fact, one of the very first expulsions in Europe of a Jewish community from an entire country. And the Jews were driven out. A little bit of an interesting fact, which we mentioned in brief passing earlier on when talking about Pesach. This is one of the earlier, not the first, but one of the earlier times when the blood libel, the accusation that Jews were somehow murdering and using the blood of Christian children, was brought to more prominent public display. Like I said, it wasn't invented here, but it was one of the more famous examples during the Middle Ages. And unfortunately, the blood libel continues to be a conspiracy against Jews, and it's so popular they'll even use it against other people. And it's one of those conspiracies that we need to constantly speak out against, because even if they are targeting someone else with this type of lie, eventually they find a way to tie it back to us and hate us again. And as anti-Semitic attacks went up 80% over the last month, I think we would be remiss if we didn't fight against those types of things. Also, in 1492, the Jews were formally expelled from Spain. There had been many edicts before to force conversion, but in 1492, it became now permanently and irrevocably, until the 20th century, a part of Spanish culture that the Jews would not be allowed to be in the country. Also, in 1914, World War I began. This is a little bit more controversial depending upon how you count the beginning of the war, but World War I was the beginning of a long sequence of events that led to the slaughter of course, 6 million Jews in Europe under the Holocaust, but also to millions of people being trapped behind the Iron Curtain and forced in the communist countries to either give up their Judaism or practice it under extremely difficult circumstances. And so World War I is a time that we commemorate as a great sorrow and tragedy. And also, on this day, Tisha B'Av, the Jews were begun to be removed from the Warsaw Ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto in Poland was a place where Jews had been forced to live and congregate in incredibly difficult circumstances at the beginning of the war. And eventually, the Nazis decided that starving us there and allowing us to die of disease was not quick enough, and that instead we needed to be liquidated. And they began to empty the Warsaw Ghetto, taking the remaining residents to the death camps. And more recently, in 1994, on Tisha B'Av, the JCC in Buenos Aires was bombed. This is one of the more deadly attacks of terrorism outside the land of Israel, and it killed about 100 people. It has since been traced back to Iranian instigation and provocation, and that has been part of an ongoing investigation. So, Tisha B'Av, there are many reasons for us to cry that all happen to be wrapped up on this day. Let me just continue our calendar before we go back to how we observe these days. So the calendar for the 3rd of Tishrei in cycle from our original timeline, which is usually in September, October, is in honor of Gedaliah, who was the last vestige of Jewish sovereignty, of Jewish autonomy in Judah under Babylonian rule. He was the governor appointed by the Babylonians, and he was assassinated by Jewish extremists, by Jewish terrorists on this day. And when that happened, the Babylonians increased and made our exile harsher, and indeed delayed our return for an additional 70 years, and we lost our sovereignty over the land of Israel completely. So that is the day right after Rosh Hashanah, and is the day when we commemorate this tragedy, which tore Israel from our hands completely at that point under the Babylonian occupation. And this too is a daytime fast. All right, so if everybody has that list, how do we know these are the dates? Well, let's go through the explanation of these dates. So we begin by a limited statement of Zechariah, the prophet in Tanakh, who says the fast of the 4th, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th. We'll come back to the rest of that verse a little bit later on. But what is being talked about? Well, Akiva said, the fast of the 4th. This is the 9th of Tammuz, on which the city was breached. As it says in Jeremiah 52, on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city. Now, you may be wondering, but wait a minute. I thought you said this was in June or July, but the 4th month, isn't that April? And that is the Gregorian counting of months. In Judaism, we count the months from the month of Nisan. The month of Pesach is the 1st month, and we count our numbered months from there. So indeed, the 4th month is the month of Tammuz. The fast of the 5th, meaning the 5th month, this is the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, on which the house of our God was burned. The fast of the 7th, this is the 3rd of Tishrei, on which Gedaliah was killed. This teaches you that the death of the righteous is given equal weight as the burning of the house of our God. So just a reminder that these are kind of out of order, because the first one to happen is going to be the last on the list, just because of the way the months are counted. But when we're now in the month of Tishrei, the month of Rosh Hashanah, we are commemorating the murder of Gedaliah. And as Rabbi Akiva is saying here from the Talmud, that is incredibly poignant, as the other fasts are all about the steps leading up to the breach of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. You might think that the murder of one person would be almost inconsequential, insignificant next to that. But no, we hold that the death of somebody like Gedaliah is equal in weight as the destruction of the temple itself. And then finally, the fast of the 10th, which was actually the first event. This is the 10th of Tevet, on which the king of Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem. As it says in Ezekiel 24, the word of the Lord came to me in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month. Son of man, write down this name of the day, this very day. The king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. So from those multiple sources, our tradition is able to interpret what Zechariah is saying to understand what these different 4 fasts represent. Now, as you can see, it's much easier if you go in order, which is why I began the lesson with the calendar order, read the event order rather than the calendar order. But in the Talmud, they discuss them based off Zechariah's verse, which is the calendar order. Everyone with me, or did I lose you with all the dates? Good. So, as there are some connections between them, we don't only commemorate them on the day. And in particular, there is a period called the 3 weeks, which, original name. And this is the period between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. This is called the 3 weeks. And during this time, it is the Ashkenazic custom to prohibit marriages and cutting hair. This is a way of saying the celebrations that we can schedule, we should reschedule. If you have a baby for a Brit Milah, well, we can't put that off. But a wedding, these 3 weeks, we don't want to pretend like we can celebrate fully, because between the breach of the walls and the destruction of the temple, we should keep in our mind that this is a sad period of the year. And as we talked about during our morning class, we refrain from cutting our hair as a sign of mourning as well. So from the 17th of Tammuz through the Tisha B'Av, there is this mild version of remembrance and mourning. From Rosh Chodesh Av, the first day of Av, until Tisha B'Av, the 9th day, then those prohibitions continue. We still don't have weddings, of course. We still don't cut hair. And no freshly pressed clothes are worn. Again, similar to the mourning we talked about in our previous class. No laundry is done. We don't freshen up our clothes. No bathing for pleasure. And many also do not eat meat, although most will make an exception for Shabbat to be able to enjoy the holiday of Shabbat with meat, which satisfies so many of us so well. So these 3 weeks and then 9 days are periods in between the major milestones where we gently increase the intensity of our remembrance so that we are properly prepared for experiencing the commemoration on Tisha B'Av itself. Questions or comments? Okay. So I'm sure you're all wondering then, when does it happen next? Well, here is our calendar. And actually, this one I probably should have put in calendar order rather than event order. So let's go in the order of the calendar that you'll be paying attention to. The 17th of Tammuz, this is going to be on June 27th. The 9th of Av, this is going to be on July 18th. The 3rd of Tishrei, that's Tzom Gedalia, that's going to be on September 9th. And then the 10th of Tevet, that's going to be on December 14th. So from June 27th through the 9th of Av, that is the period known as the 3 weeks. And from the beginning of Av, which is day 1 of Av, until July 18th, that'll be the 9 days of Av. Most Jewish calendars will have this quite clear. A reminder of some of the sources that I've shared before. You can always check out hebcal, hebcal.com, to find an in-depth Jewish calendar that will tell you every year when all of these are observed. And the observances are what we're going to talk about now. So first of all, let's talk about the restrictions. What is it we don't do? What does it mean to fast in Judaism? Well, in Judaism, a fast will mean we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't wear leather shoes, we don't bathe or wash for pleasure, but we will for hygiene or ritual purity if necessary. We don't anoint for pleasure. Anointing was the wearing of perfumes or special oils that made a person more beautiful or smell better. Of course, for hygiene or medical excuse me, hygiene or medical reasons, of course you can, and no marital relations. That is to say, loving couples are not physically loving on these days. A reminder, actually not a reminder because we haven't talked about Yom Kippur yet, so a preview, the not wearing of leather shoes. That is because historically leather shoes were considered to be a sign of pride and arrogance. And so when you wear leather on your feet, you are in the culture of Judaism saying, I'm so wonderful, I'm so great. And when you're feeling like that, it's hard to actually feel the sadness that you should be feeling. Just like we talked about in the morning class, in Judaism, we believe that a person should feel sad at certain points in life. We don't run from sadness. We find a way to embrace it. We also, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, find ways to limit sadness so that we are not in a perpetual state of sadness. Questions?
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a question, Rabbi. These 4 days, we have to do those restrictions on these 4 days?
Exactly. Now, like I mentioned, for 3 of them, it's only during the daytime. On Tisha B'Av, it's from the night before until the next night.
Okay, so how long is the first 3 days? You said again?
So the first 3 days, let me just go back up to our calendar here. On the 10th of Tevet, the 17th of Tammuz, and the 3rd of Tishrei, it is only during the daytime.
From morning to evening?
From morning until nightfall, yes.
Okay.
And then the Tisha B'Av, we would actually begin the fast on the 17th of July and continue until the evening, the nightfall at on the 18th.
Okay.
Thank you for clearing that up. I also want to remind everybody that with regards to eating and drinking, if a person has instructions from their doctor that they need to eat or drink for the benefit of their health, if they are taking certain medicines that require some food, if they are of different types of blood conditions that require a constant eating or drinking, then by all means, you must follow your doctor's instructions. You're not being some tough, perfectly pious, saintly person by endangering your life. There are many other ways to commemorate these days other than putting yourself in danger. Please, please, please obey the instructions of your doctors. And if you have any questions about that, then you probably should be following your doctor's instructions. If you're really unclear, then of course, contact me individually and I'll be happy to tell you that personally. Now, there are some additional practices on Tisha B'Av as well. So for example, on Tisha B'Av, just on Tisha B'Av, it is customary to not extend greetings. Greetings are usually a sign of cheerful welcome. Hi, how are you doing? Shabbat Shalom, Boker Tov, all of those wonderful things. On Tisha B'Av, it is not a wonderful day. And so we don't greet each other with that kind of enthusiasm. We come together for services, and we usually have a community service for Tisha B'Av. We come together for services, and we are together, which is a wonderful and amazing experience, but not a happy one. And so we tone down our greetings. It is also customary to sit on the floor. Some people will sit on the floor the entire time, much like we talked about with mourning. A person might sit on the floor or stools to keep themselves in that low position. Others will only observe this while engaged in the service, or maybe during the chanting of Eicha, which I'll explain in a second. We also do not wear tefillin or the talit gadol. We don't wear the tefillin, the boxes on the arms or the head, and we don't wear the big talit during the morning service. Those are considered to be our crown, our adornment. And on Tisha B'Av, especially in the morning, when our pain is most strongest, we do not feel adorned, and it would be almost arrogant just to say that we are. But since they are mitzvot, we do wear them later in the day in order that we can make sure that we've done them at least once during the day. It is also customary to avoid any of our regular study. Instead, if somebody wishes to study, they'll study Job or Eicha, which is the book of Lamentation, or many sections taken from the book of Jeremiah, who was the prophet specifically at the end of the First Temple period. One of the things that I really appreciate about this is it's reminding us that Torah study is joyful. It makes us happy. And so we actually have to remove our usual study in order that we can feel the right mood of the day. One other point that comes up and is often confusing, on Tisha B'Av, you are still allowed to do work. It is not a holiday like Pesach. It is not a holiday like Shabbat. And you may not feel like doing work, and that's fine. But if you need to do your job, or if you need to do other work, technical work on Jewish definition, it is still allowed on Tisha B'Av. All right. Now, because of the destruction, there are some other practices and customs that are observed in different communities. So this is a list of different ones. I'll try and explain ones that are still commonly held and ones that are not. So it is still not unusual if a person is painting the house, the inside of their house, to leave a 1 cubit area, a 18 by 18 inches space that is unpainted. That's about half a meter for those of you more comfortable in the metric. And this is a way of saying that since God's house is destroyed, my house can't be perfect. And by leaving one part of it unfinished, it is a reminder. And that is still not unusual, at least among people who paint their house. Nowadays, most people don't bother painting their house. It's usually painted when they move in, and they may never paint it again. But if you paint the area near your doorway, it is still quite common for people to observe that custom. There are some authorities that, in fact, prohibited any ornate or especially beautiful wall decorations, Rambam being one of them. This is a custom which is not widely observed. Most people are okay having wall decorations. But 1,000 years ago in his community in North Africa, it was more common to observe that limit. Some people will often leave an empty place at their table as though it was being set for guests and one did not attend. Again, this is not widely observed on a regular basis. Some will leave jewelry sets incomplete, meaning that if you are making or purchasing or commissioning for someone to make a necklace for you, if there are supposed to be 13, diamonds, you'll just have 12 and leave one gap, just as a way of leaving a little bit incomplete. In some communities, although not usually ours, the groom will put ashes on his forehead. Again, this is not commonly observed, but in some communities it is. Some authorities prohibited any music and song at all, meaning for some of them, meaning if you were outside of services, you would not be allowed to sing a just regular song. Now, this is almost universally not followed. But during an earlier period in our history, there were some authorities who said, how can I sing when the temple is in ruins? It turns out we can sing pretty well and still remember the tragedy and still learn from it. And we're going to be talking about that balance between mourning enough and mourning too much. So we'll be going through that in more detail. But these are some of the customs you may see or hear. And it is also the custom in the ancient world that when a person would travel to Israel and they would see Jerusalem, which was a ruin for most of its history, that they would tear their clothes, just as you tear when you are mourning for a relative. Now, this leads to a bit of a question in the modern world, which is when you visit Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not in ruins these days. Yes, the Temple Mount is still not completely rebuilt, obviously, but it is a city that is controlled by our people. It is a city where Jews are allowed to pray. It is a city where Jews are free, and there was so much life and vitality. And as I can say, without fear of contradiction from Roberta, when we traveled to Israel, well, I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, and we came in and we went up to the view looking into the city of Jerusalem for the first time on our trip together, which was the first time for many people who had never been to Israel. We did not tear our clothes. Instead, we celebrated the fact that Jerusalem was such a beautiful and vibrant city, and we only wish it more peace and wonderful future. So this is something that we have had to wrestle with, and I'll talk about that as well in a bit more detail, that the reestablishment of the state of Israel from 1948 onward has meant that the mood of some of these days has significantly changed for the better. But we'll come back to that nearer the end. So let's talk first about why we do these commemorations and why is it that we believe that the temples themselves were destroyed. Well, it says in Yoma, why was the first temple destroyed, the Temple of Solomon, by the Babylonians? Because of three evils, meaning that there were three sins that were especially common at that time: idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed, meaning murder. And if you've read through the prophets of that time period, absolutely, they are constantly talking about these issues. I should point out immorality here means in particular sexual immorality, which was most often in the form of adultery. But why was the second temple destroyed? Seeing that during that time it stood, people occupied themselves with Torah, the observance of mitzvot, and with the practice of tzedakah. And indeed, both by historical and archaeological records, it is clear that during the time of the Second Temple, the people became better. They were doing a better job of observing Judaism. However, because during the time it stood, baseless hatred, what's called sinat chinam, prevailed. This is to teach you that sinat chinam, baseless hatred, is deemed as grave as all three sins of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed together. So although people may think, yeah, so we're not always at peace with each other and people can bicker and fight, that's not so bad. As long as I'm observant, then everything's okay. It turns out that in God's accounting, that if we are hateful to one another, that even if we're not shedding blood, even if we are not committing adultery, and even if we're not worshiping idols, that we are still tearing apart our world. And that hate is incredibly, incredibly damaging and corrosive. And the proof is in the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. Indeed, we then have to contend with, given how bad it was, given the devastation, how do we mourn? And how much should we mourn? So indeed, this comes also from the Talmud to try and help us answer that question. The rabbis taught, when the Second Temple, sorry, my computer just blinked on me. The rabbis taught, when the Second Temple was destroyed, many of Israel stopped eating meat and drinking wine, meaning altogether, permanently. They were so sad they couldn't even drink wine or eat meat, which went along with all of the normal celebrations in life. Now they were saying, never again. Rabbi Joshua said to them, my children, why do you not eat meat and drink wine? They replied, should we eat meat of which sacrifices were brought, or drink wine which was offered at the altar? Right? It's too much of a reminder. The sacrifices, they were meat. And if I go to eat a nice piece of brisket, I only can think about the temple. When I go to drink the wine, I can only think about the offerings of wine. It's if the temple is destroyed and the temple cannot do these things, how could I do them? Rabbi Joshua said to them, if so, let us not eat bread, as the meal offering is also gone. He points out to them, actually flour was often sacrificed too. So if you're not going to eat things that were offered in the sacrifices, then you shouldn't be eating bread. And their response, fine, then we can live on fruit, they replied. They said, we'll just eat fruit. But was there not also the first fruit offering? Meaning that there was a special offering to bring from many of the species of fruit, a special offering. Let us then cease the use of fruit. So now they are going to not eat meat, not drink wine, not eat bread, not eat these special types of fruit. And he points out, was it not also the custom to put water on the altar, which no longer exists? And they were silent. So he points out to them, there was also a very special water offering, a water libation at the time of Sukkot. So if you're going to not do anything that was done in the temple, then that means you're not going to be drinking water anymore. What he is trying to do here is show them the illogical conclusion of their decision to cut everything out of their life that was connected to the temple. That's not what Judaism teaches. Just like when we mourn for a human loved one, we don't cut everything out of our life that reminds us of them. Instead, we find many ways to hold on to the things that reminded us of them in a new way that can actually make life better and bring the memories to mind with fondness rather than despair. However, Rabbi Joshua is not saying we don't mourn. Instead, he continues by offering them an alternative. Then said Rabbi Joshua to them, "My children, come and listen to me. It would be wrong not to mourn at all, because the evil decree is executed, right? There was a destruction. How could we not be sad? But to mourn too much is also impossible, as there must not be decreed a prohibition for the congregation which they could not stand." The rabbis were very clear in many places, this one of them, that when they were making decrees for the community, they would never make a decree, a limitation, a rule that the community was unable to perform. The law was meant to be fulfilled. It was not meant to be beyond reach. And certainly saying to people, you can't eat meat, wine, fruit, bread, and drink water, that would be impossible. So instead, therefore the sages said, when one paints his house, he shall leave a part unpainted as a sign of mourning. When one prepares all that he needs for his meal, leaving out some little thing is a sign of mourning. And the same is the case with a woman, when she may dress with all her ornaments, leaving out some of the unimportant for that purpose, as I mentioned before from Rambam's teaching. And indeed, Rabbi Ishmael bar Elisha said, from that day when the temple was destroyed, it would be only right that we should take upon ourselves not to eat meat and drink wine, but such a thing which the majority of the congregation could not endure must not be decreed. So he's reminding us that yes, their heart was in the right place, that they felt this sadness. Of course, that's normal, but that is not the way that a human can live. And therefore, even if you individually could, the congregation, the community cannot, and therefore we will not decree that. But even more important than how we are observing it is how long will we observe it? And I don't mean how long will we observe them from daytime to daytime or from night to night. I mean, for how many years? And the word of the Lord of hosts came to me saying, thus said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, that's the 17th of Tammuz, and the fast of the 5th, that's Tisha B'Av, the fast of the 7th, the 3rd of Tishrei, and the fast of the 10th, that's the 10th of Tevet, shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness and cheerful feasts. Therefore, love the truth and peace. Zechariah is trying to tell us that in the days of redemption, in the days of Mashiach, certainly, that these days, the days that have been days of sadness, will be changed, that they will become days of rejoicing. And that will give us a chance to redeem them into happiness. As it says again in the Talmud, Rabbi Chana bar Bizna said, that Rabbi Shimon Hasida said, what is the meaning of that which is written in Zechariah? God called them fasts, and then he called them joy and gladness. In times of peace, they shall be joy and gladness. If there is no peace, fasts. So his first teaching is to say, if there is peace, then yes, we can celebrate those days. If there is no peace, then they are fast days. Said Rav Papa, let me adjust this. In times of peace, they shall be joy and gladness. If there are decrees by the government, then they will be fasts, meaning if there are harsh times. If there are no decrees by the government, but also not peace, those who wish fast and those who wish do not fast. If it is the case, then someone argues, if that's the case, that we are with 3 time zones, peacetime, neutral time, and harsh time, then does that mean even for Tisha B'Av, we could also follow that rule? Said Rav Papa in response, the case of the Tisha B'Av of the 9th of Av is different since so many misfortunes occurred on that day, meaning it is not only in reference to the timeline that was given by Zechariah and the sages of the destruction of the first temple. As we saw, there was that huge list, and I should point out an even longer full list of every historical event that's happened on that day. And therefore, Tisha B'Av will always be observed until there is final peace and redemption. Excuse me, didn't mean to go one more. And indeed, this is where many people in the modern world will sit, that when we are in the modern world with the miracle of the state of Israel, which we call, that is the Reshit Nichat Ulatenu, the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption, that we cannot pretend that it is completely like the days of the Romans with the city of Jerusalem plowed into dirt. And we also can't pretend like it is perfectly fine like it will be in the days of the Messiah, having just finished 11 days of horrible bloodshed and violence in the land of Israel. We know it is not in a time of perfect peace. So there are some authorities who say, with Israel in its current state, we can let the individual decide. If the individual wants to observe the fast days that we went through, then they can. If they don't want to observe them in honor of Israel as being a foretaste of redemption, then they can not observe the fast days. But Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, everybody agrees that we continue until there is a final redemption and peace. Is that clear? As the old saying goes, it depends. I just wanted to leave with 2 other days of fasting, but they are a little different, but I wanted to put them in somewhere in the class. So before the holiday of Purim, it is customary to observe what is called Ta'anit Esther. And the fast of Esther is a fast in commemoration of the instructions that Esther gave to the Jews of Shushan to fast for 3 days prior to her going to the king to try to save her people. Now, she and the people fasted for 3 days. We do not. We only fast for 1 day, and this is a daytime fast, meaning from morning till night. The next time this will be observed is, of course, before next Purim, which is March 16 of 2022. There is also a fast before Pesach that is a more recent custom called Ta'anit Bechorot, and this is a fast for the firstborn only, meaning if you are the firstborn of your mother, then you would observe this daytime fast, the next time being April 15th, 2022. However, this fast is still new enough that it is not universally observed everywhere, and many communities, the Orlando community included, will often preempt the fast by having a siyum. A siyum is a special celebration in commemoration of finishing a significant piece of learning. And so people will schedule a celebration to celebrate their learning on that day in order that you don't need to fast. And instead we can celebrate and prepare for Pesach with a full stomach and with a full understanding. But that is because this is a relatively new status and not universally observed in every community. And as I mentioned, even though I'm doing them on this class, these particular days are not really considered to be sad or mournful days. They are simply days to be mindful of some of the events of our past. And really, they are meant to be more of preparing us to be properly grateful for the holiday of Purim and the holiday of Pesach. Are there any questions or comments? Because we have come to the end of our material for today. All right. In that case, everybody should be well and good until I get to see you again. Hopefully that's over Shabbat. But if not, a reminder that for the next 4 weeks, we will not be having the Pathway class on Thursday. Our next class on Pathway to Judaism will be on July 1st. Take care, everyone.
Enjoy your vacation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a wonderful vacation.